Howdy howdy, I'm Cody and this is Creation Outdoors, and today I'm going to start a new series called Hunt Breakdown. And with the benefit of hindsight, my hope is with this series to break down some of my successful hunts from the last couple years, just as a reminder to myself in preparation for this upcoming season now that preparation is in full swing, and perhaps they could be helpful for you too as you plan your upcoming hunts this fall. So the first hunt in this series that I'm going to feature is my successful hunt from last year, which was in Iowa on public land, and I was fortunate enough to get a great buck. So I'm going to put on the screen right now a map, and this map is not an approximate map, it is the actual area that I hunted. No faking out here, because I think it's going to be the most useful for you and for me to really look at the details of this exact hunt and break down the details of this exact hunt so that it can be the most informative. So this hunt featured this primary ridge, as you can see in the middle of the screen. And we've got a couple waypoints here, which I'll come to a little bit later. But this hunt is really the story of two separate days. So the first day was November 12, and November 12 featured a really strong north wind. So coming from the top of this ridge and blowing down this ridge towards where I parked. It was about 30-mile-an-hour wind, 50-mile-an-hour gusts, and a massive cold front. So I figured I was going to bundle up like a marshmallow and work my way up that ridge. And my plan was to work my way up this ridge towards this ag, because I figured, and this is one of the features of this piece and why I picked this piece, I thought that deer would maybe be downwind of this ag field and work their way into this ag field towards dusk. It was the first major cold front of the year, the first snow of the year here in Iowa, and it was the peak of the rut. So I thought that there could be some seeking going on by mature bucks south of this cornfield. It was corn at the time. Regardless, I started down at the tip of this finger ridge, and I got in pretty early because again, it was overcast, windy, and I was going to use that wind to my advantage to work up this ridge and set up on the ground. So I didn't know where I was going, really. It was the first time in this piece, and so I started up this ridge, and I encountered right about here, right at the point where the ridge kind of peters off, a very fresh bed. So there was snow kind of in the area, and you could see the oval where the deer had bedded where there wasn't any snow. And so at that point I knew that I was certainly in the game. I was excited to see this bed. Whether it was a buck or a doe, it was deer sign, which in my opinion in early November you're either in deer or you're not. And the best bet is to be in deer because that's where both the bucks and the does are going to be. So very fresh bed, definitely from that day, and super encouraging to keep moving forward. Now lo and behold, it did not take very much time before I worked up just a hair more, probably about 40-50 yards, and I bumped a small buck and a doe. And again, they were bedded at the very tip of this ridge. So the wind was coming from the north, they were bedded here, they could see what was coming from this two-track road, and they could smell everything that was up the ridge from them. And it was interesting because this buck had this doe pinned against this big downfall, and I'm putting some clips of that downfall here on the video, and it was really intriguing because it was super informative for how bucks are going to bed and how bucks are going to bed with a doe. But I snuck up to them within 20 yards. They were just over kind of the crest of the ridge, so I never saw them until they were busting out of their beds, and they worked their way up straight into the wind, right the direction I was going. So I was a little bit bummed about that, but what are you going to do? I was going to try and use this as an advantage, maybe a bump and dump strategy, and perhaps something was going to come on the trail of that hot doe to try and find where they were, and I was going to intercept them. So what I did was work my way up the ridge to this first waypoint here. So here, I moved my way to kind of the left side of the ridge, hoping that the majority of the ridge would be to my right so that everything would still be upwind of me. Nonetheless, later in the day, the wind shifted to a little bit the northwest, and so there ended up being some swirling action on this side of the ridge where I did have some does blow at me later in the day. But regardless, I got set up in this downfall, kind of brushy blind here, and really started to settle in. And my hope was that there would be some deer, again, cruising maybe across this ridge or maybe down this ridge to find where that hot doe had been. Lucky for me, I set up on a pretty fresh trail, because it wasn't too much later. I had a small buck, a small 8-point, walk within 4 yards of where I was on the ground. Now, I was so frazzled I didn't even start recording on the camera, which made me feel pretty foolish. But regardless, super encouraging, because this was the best encounter I'd had with a buck all season to this point. I got my tags late, had some dud hunts, and this was super encouraging. He kind of got downwind of me and scampered off eventually, and not a big deal. Wasn't too spooked. He really wanted to get to the point of this ridge where he knew that doe had been, but was smart enough and just old enough where he wasn't going to walk past me again. So the rest of the evening proved a little bit less eventful, with the exception of farther up the ridge, I kept seeing some does really coming up the side of the ridge, which I didn't expect. But it gave me some information moving forward that there was certainly more deer traffic than where I was farther up the ridge. So that gave me confidence to come back. I knew that the spot was pretty hot, so to speak, and there was definitely more deer activity here than some of the other pieces of public that I had been hunting in the area. So I let the place sit for a day, and I let the place sit for a day simply because I didn't have the right wind to hunt it. So we move forward to November 14, and on November 14, we had another north wind, but this time super gentle. But I thought that if I worked my way up the ridge a little bit farther, the wind would hold, I wouldn't have less swirling kind of down in the basin, and I'd be able to pick up some of that traffic that I saw farther up the ridge from where I was. And as you can see, I really only moved about 60 yards up the ridge, but that was enough to make a difference. So again, I worked my way up the same ridge right here. This is about where those deer had bedded before. I worked my way past that previous blind where I sat on the ground, up to this spot in this tree where I wanted to sit. And again, it was just an approximation based on where I had seen the deer movement crossing this ridge 2 days before. But as you can see here from the topographical lines, the ridge actually does flatten out into a shelf here, and it's surprisingly expansive. So I think that ended up working in my favor. So trying to find some of these benches or saddles definitely seems to concentrate deer movement in this hilly country, kind of where I was hunting this year. And it turned out to be the right move. So I got into the stand and it was like 11 o'clock a.m. Again, I wanted to be in really early so that I could catch any of the evening movement and any of the midday movement, which turned out to be the right call. And it wasn't actually too long after I got into the stand where I saw a buck following a doe actually from the direction that I didn't expect. So I didn't anticipate any deer coming up this side of the ridge. Again, I had north wind, so I was fine, but a buck was following a doe up the ridge this way. And they worked their way off, again, kind of up the ridge towards this ag. It wasn't too long after that where I saw, again, further up this ridge, I think the same buck that I had seen 2 nights previous. Tough to tell. There's a pretty high stem count here in this little platform on this ridge, and so again, that was the reason why I ended up sitting there. Regardless, it was like 11 a.m. I had already seen 2 bucks with a doe, super pumped. And then I had a small spike also come through, kind of catch my wind, and then headed up the ridge. So everything was still going up ridge with me. So I was a little bit disappointed, but still hopeful that something would be coming my way, especially if this was still morning traffic working their way up the ridge. Perhaps something would come down in the evening or afternoon my way. And again, hoping that maybe there was a hot doe in the area. It sure seemed like there was, and something a little bit bigger would come my way. It really wasn't that much longer, 1:30-ish, so definitely midday. You know, pretty bright, very calm, and I look up the ridge and I see what was immediately to me a shooter buck, you know, working its way this side of the ridge. And so it was definitely headed pretty much straight down the ridge, headed kind of the direction where I'd seen the does come from a couple nights previous, maybe headed down to bed on this point here where I'd seen those other two beds. I'm not entirely sure, but I happened to be just on the edge of the right spot to be able to get a 40-yard shot at this buck, which turned out to be his mistake. So he was totally clueless. I did end up stopping the buck. He was a little bit quartered to, ducked a little bit. I hit him a little bit far forward, but I knew that he was definitely hurting. And it seemed like he went down not too far over the ridge. To my excitement, after I got down and went over there, he didn't go 15 yards and he was piled up. And I finally got, you know, my public land buck for last year. First deer in Iowa, first true public land buck, and it was awesome. It was definitely a learning experience, figuring out this new piece of public, and really figuring out that when you're in the right spot, you're in the right spot. I know that seems super cliche and obvious, but it's tremendously true. If you're in the beginning of November and you know that you're in an area with deer and you're not seeing deer, it is time to move and find some of these landscape features like this little bench on this ridge with this ridge point bedding that are going to work to your advantage. This happened to work to my advantage, and again, I anticipated making my way so much farther up here. Again, the benefit of hindsight, I know that there's a guy who happens to hunt in a very permanent stand in a huge tree up here every single morning, and he said he's done that for the last 20 years. So it's probably for the best that I didn't make it up that far. Regardless, I found this nice little feature on this nice little ridge where it flattened out and concentrated the deer movement, and with a couple hot does I ended up getting a shot at a great buck. So that is the hunt breakdown from last year, 2021. So again, takeaways: find land features that are going to work in your favor, whether that's a creek crossing, a saddle, a little flattened spot on the ridge near some bedding, whatever it may be. Try to identify those spots ahead of time and work your way into those under the right conditions, and you might just get lucky like I did. 2, look for overlooked pieces of public land. I was hunting some other larger tracts of public land that seemed to get a lot more pressure than this piece. And my first time in this piece, I immediately saw more deer movement than I had the rest of the year. So find those overlooked spots, find those features that are going to work to your advantage, and find the deer movement. If you're not in deer during that first couple weeks in November, maybe late October, it's time to move. Explore around, you know, burn those best spots. Really take risks because it's going to be worth it, because there's only a limited number of days that you're going to be able to hunt in that time of year. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions about this particular map, this particular spot, I'm not going to tell you where it is, but you can probably figure it out, or this particular hunt, leave a comment below and I will answer, because I want you to be successful just as I want to be successful, because that's the fun of hunting, is when people find success. So I hope this was helpful. Subscribe so you catch the next hunt breakdown video of my buck 2 years ago, which is another really neat rep type situation, but this time rather than a cold front, it was a warm front, because that November was way hot. So take 2.5 seconds, subscribe and like this video, and if you leave a comment or have a question, drop it below and I will answer it. Thanks for watching, I appreciate you, and we'll see you on the next one.